Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am O'Brien McMahon, and this is People Business. In this episode, I'm joined by Lori Becker. Lori is the Chief Executive Officer at the Starkloff Disability Institute, SDI. In her role, Lori oversees the organization's efforts to advance inclusion, access, and equity for people with disabilities in all aspects of society, and especially in the workforce. As a leader with a disability herself, Lori is passionate about diversity and inclusion and was named Diverse Business Leader in 2019 by the St. Louis Business Journal. We go pretty deep into disability here. Lori, in the beginning of this, has a great history of how we as a society and as a workforce have approached disability. And then we go from there to talk about the current state of things today, what it means to have a disability, the vast array of different disabilities that are out there, and how employers can be more friendly toward this community and also get more out of this community by being more accommodating, and how that enhances performance of the overall business and solidifies the culture and just has a lot of great benefits when you start to really listen to the people and their needs. And she says too, that this isn't about having a lower standard. This is about keeping your high standard, but just helping people reach that standard who maybe need a little bit different accommodations than others. So really eye-opening conversation. I'm sort of embarrassed that we are as far into this podcast as we are, and we have not covered this topic yet, because as she says, 1 in 4 people in the workforce would qualify as having a disability. This is a big portion of the population and one that we should all be paying attention to. Last thing I'll say is if you're interested in this or any other topic that we talk about on the show, feel free to reach out to me with a direct message through LinkedIn. Happy to connect folks with Lori and Starkloff as a resource, and also just always happy to have more of these conversations with business and people leaders who are passionate about this the way that I am. That's it. Here is Lori Becker. Lori, welcome to the show. Excited to jump in and talk about disability today. This is, we're about 160 to 170 interviews into this adventure on People Business, and we have not covered this topic, which is a very important one. So I feel negligent for having not covered it before, but I'm glad that we were connected so we could dive into it today.
Well, thank you, O'Brien. Excited for the conversation.
Let's just start at the beginning, sort of set the table. What is Starkloff, and how did you come to be associated with it and move up into your role running the organization?
Well, that's a great question. Starkloff Disability Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are headquartered in the Midwest in St. Louis, Missouri. And we are, I would say, one of the most important organizations advancing disability rights and inclusion across the United States and beyond our borders even. Our organization is very much rooted in the disability rights movement that came out of the 1970s, kind of adjacent and interwoven through the civil rights movement. And so we are a disability-led organization. That's one of our most important values, is that people with disabilities are at the forefront of designing and leading the work of the disability community, policies that impact our people the most. So our organization focuses our work in 2 areas, I would say. We have employment and leadership programs for individuals with disabilities themselves, ranging from middle school all the way up through senior adulthood. And those programs are led by professionals with disabilities themselves. And they are designed to teach people really how to leverage their strengths as a person with a disability in the workforce and then in all aspects of society. The other half of our work is much more public facing, and we teach non-disabled and disabled people alike to be disability confident. And that means understanding our history, our culture, what accommodations are. And it really centers disability as part of diversity.
Got it. Thank you. I'd love to sort of just get a little bit of the lay of the land on disability landscape. And I know we were kind of joking before this. You're not an attorney. There are a lot of laws out there with nuances in them. So I don't want to necessarily go into like what every law says, but could you just kind of walk through the history of disability law? How did it start in the 70s and sort of where have we come today? Like what is the state of the world today and how much progress have we made and how much progress do we still have to make?
Yeah. Thanks for this question, because I think it's an opportunity to provide a kind of a larger tapestry. Where we are today, we have to know where we were, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to approach this question through the models of disability. And that's maybe a phrase that not many people are familiar with, but it's just kind of the framework or the mindset and approach to disability that we have had over the years. It began in I'm going to focus just in the United States in the past 150, 200 years, because it could go very, very wide and very deep. But in the United States, there was originally a moral model of disability. This is obviously in the 17, 1800s. People thought that a disabled person or disabled child was born because of some moral failing of the parents or the individual themselves. And those individuals were really just to be pitied and perhaps, pray over for healing, those types of things. You move into the late 1800s and people with disabilities became institutionalized. They opened separate facilities to house people with disabilities. Then there was a medical model after that as advances in medicine came about. Then people with disabilities were meant to be cured. There was a lot of experimentation, exploitation, trying to cure everyone. And there are remnants of that still in our society today when you see a lot of a 5K to cure Alzheimer's, or, there's a lot of those cure-based approaches are very much still entrenched in society. Not all bad, because then we do need advances in medicine, obviously, but some individuals with disabilities, like myself, who I'm legally blind and I have epilepsy, I've been around for more than 4 decades now, no cures at all for that, right?
Yeah.
So now we move into the social model of disability, which is really more where we are today. And it recognizes the disability community as individuals, as equal participants in our society, and that we have a valuable lived experience that should be included in all aspects of society. People with disabilities should be able to fully participate equally, equitably in society. So that's where we are right now. This social model of disability, although it's been around since that civil rights movement, we are still trying to gain traction on that. And I will say that there is historically been legislation, as you say, the laws that have kind of reflected that move from the moral to the medical to the social model. Equal rights for individuals. There was a variety of legislation all the way through the 1940s when disabled activists who were mostly white male wheelchair users. And so they were the ones who had the most privilege to lead the charge for disability rights and inclusion, and in particular in the workforce. So there were some minor laws back in the day to kind of help for that inclusion, but even the New Deal policies, the WPA, excluded people from disabilities from employment. And so, which is so ironic, right? Because we're talking about FDR.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And so the first real remarkable piece of legislation, I would say, is in 1973. It was called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that pertained to the federal government. The federal government and its contractors had to provide equal access for services and programs to people with disabilities. And then that law kind of was hit or miss. It wasn't truly enforced. 1975 saw the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that ensured that equal access to education. And then in 1990, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. It took a lot of the tenets that were in that Rehab Act of 1973, but it expanded from the federal government down to state and local governments had to provide those same protections. It ensured equitable employment, access to telecommunications, access to transportation. And that was just in 1990. So where it's very, very recent that we were actually able to gain real civil rights. And then it wasn't until 2014, and your listeners may be really interested in this one if we're talking about employment. It wasn't until 2014 that the federal government, Department of Labor in particular, actually said that Section 503 of that Rehab Act that had been passed, 50 years prior, that they actually got teeth put into it. And it said, okay, employers, you need to hire 7% of your workforce, people with disabilities. Before it just said that they should, provide equal access, but there were no repercussions from it. And there wasn't a hiring goal. So now it was again, 10 years ago, they finally said you are required to hire 7% of your workforce across all job levels of people with disabilities. And the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Policy are in charge of monitoring that. And now they're even conducting audits to see how companies are doing to get to that goal.
Really?
So we've come a long way from being institutionalized and tortured and made to be forced to work in the circus. That literally was a thing.
Yeah.
Where we are today, but yet there is still so much further to go. But we're all doing the work. We're getting out and raising public awareness and taking action, and being here today is just part of that.
Yeah, thank you. That was a fantastic history, and also a very sad one. If going all the way back, we have 2 young boys, and one of our sons has some food allergies, and I just know, the thoughts that pop into your head, my wife and I, around, is there something we could have done different? Like the mom guilt is real for sure. Should she have eaten something different or done something different? And, and we live in a society where we know that that those things aren't correlated, but it's still that guilt can be there. I can't imagine if all of society was actually looking at you and going, no, this is your fault. It would just be a horrible burden to bear.
There are still some remnants of that, of even for individuals who, as a good example is the deaf community is very, very strong, cultural, tight-knit community. Some individuals choose not to get a cochlear implant. Sometimes it's a choice, sometimes it's a medical issue, but for the individuals who are deaf, who decide not to get the cochlear implant, they're oftentimes looked down upon from hearing people, not necessarily deaf people, but it's their right to not have that. And they have, language access through American Sign Language, and that is their preferred method of communication. But there are definitely judgments that are made on individuals who don't feel like going through those medical advancements and are comfortable just in their own body the way they are.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Well, we all judge each other all the time. It's just sort of a part of human nature that there's a lot of judgment out there, and having something that is easily identified from the outside as being different, it just opens people up to a whole negative world, which hopefully we are doing away with little by little, making progress. But yeah, I could totally see that. Let's just I want to hit pause for 1 second too, and just define disability for a second. You mentioned wheelchairs, you've mentioned hearing loss, you mentioned your own epilepsy and blindness. What's the range that we are talking about here? It seems pretty large.
It's very broad. And the disability community is the largest minority group in the United States and across the globe. And when I say that, I mean kind of a protected class of citizens. So 1 in 4 people have a disability that would be protected under the ADA. So the ADA says that a disability is an impairment that significantly limits one or more life activities. So that is broad, and it was with intention that it was broad. 70% of disabilities are non-visible. Like if you would see me walking down the street, you probably wouldn't know that I am legally blind unless I'm using my white cane, which I do sometimes, or that I have epilepsy. A few examples of the non-visible disabilities, because people just don't know. Cognitive and intellectual disabilities, things like Down syndrome, anything that's like brain related, traumatic brain injury, autism, ADHD, ADD. Then you move into like the sensory disabilities, like the hearing, seeing, tasting. There's definitely, even my own condition that I have is a form of macular degeneration. Even the blind community has such a spectrum, from total blindness, which is much more rare, to individuals who are considered legally blind, or the term that I actually prefer to use is called low vision. And I use a variety of low vision aids to help me see things and understand print. There are the mobility disabilities that are more easily seen, whether you have a spinal cord injury or, quadriplegia, paraplegia. Cerebral palsy causes a lot of mobility disabilities as well. Again, that's a spectrum. Some people with CP are fine just walking unaided. Some use a cane, some use a wheelchair. It's a broad spectrum. Hearing loss. Also, like medical conditions that you might not think of. Cancer is covered under the
I was going to
ADA.
ask you about that. Yeah. Like, is a temporary medical condition like a cancer, or I don't know, something, broken arm, or like something maybe a little more severe than that, but something that you're going through that does limit you, but that you'll likely get through?
Yes. So if you break your leg or your arm and you are experiencing difficulty going back to work or doing one of your, in tasks because of it, you're covered under the ADA. Your employer is required to help provide you a reasonable accommodation during that time period. Pregnancy is also anything related to an accommodation during pregnancy. That's also covered. Couple more of those very common but not seen disabilities are asthma, diabetes. Diabetes is also
diabetes
there.
Is one.
So many people like working in just offices all over the place, have those different medical conditions. All of them would be considered a person with a disability, but they may not consider themselves one, or might not even know that they're a part of this group.
Wow. Yeah, I guess I didn't realize quite how broad it was. So for you doing your work then, I mean, that's a big spectrum of people to serve, as well as, I would imagine, we'll get into a little bit, just different needs, different approaches. How do you think about the work you're doing? Is it broken into different categories, or are there some broad things you're trying to advocate for? Like, how do you break down the role of Starkloff when it comes to that spectrum?
I love this question. And it's because we are rooted in the disability rights movement, that the work that we are trying to advance will improve the lives of all people with disabilities, ranging from those who have very significant disabilities that really limit their participation in society, to myself, and individuals who we serve that are college graduates, masters, PhDs, but still we all experience the same barriers to inclusion. Sometimes those barriers vary, like physically what we might need, but what we need from society is the same thing. And that is understanding of our community, at least a baseline understanding of who we are as a part of diversity, that we are our own culture. We all need a shift in mindset from the non-disabled community, from employers, to begin to value the work that we can contribute. and laws that increase accessibility to transportation, to education, to public spaces that are still not physically accessible or are not welcoming environments. So all of those principles, those philosophies that we believe in, we try to advance, benefit not just all disabled people, but all of society too, because then you get to reap the benefits of increased access and the benefit of having this wonderful community be more engaged.
Yeah, I love that. Can you talk to the different levels? I think we covered this when we were debriefing earlier on, and you had mentioned that there are maybe 3 different kind of levels of disability employment. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. So when we're talking about the levels of employment, there are 3 different levels that are somewhat distinct that employers and individuals should know about. What we strive for at Starkloff and the Disability Rights Movement and our Centers for Independent Living across the country, we advocate for the full integration of individuals in competitive mainstream jobs. And that is, fair wages, the same wages as everyone else, same working condition, same opportunities for advancement. And those jobs can be, professional jobs, like myself, I'm in an office, people who are accountants and, people who we have nurses and things of that nature. And just there are people with disabilities that are working in very high level positions that may not identify themselves as a person with a disability because of that fear of weakness, of the stigma that is attached to disability. But we strive for our folks to have those like mainstream competitive jobs. There is another type of employment called supported employment where our government, federal and state government, have programs for individuals who have an intellectual disability or developmental disability work in an integrated environment, but with the assistance of a job coach usually. And that can range from someone who's there every single day helping that person, or, someone who comes and checks in once a week just to make sure their their client, who is an employee, say, of a hospital or a grocery store, the company employs that person, but then the government provides a job coach to come in, make sure that that person's needs are being met, see if there's any issues, things like that. Helps that person remain a really strong contributor to that organization. But that job coach might be, have 10 different or 20 clients that are working it all over the place. And so they go in and help them be really successful on the job. And that's considered supported employment. And there's a lot of government programs out there that help do this. And it's really great that we have those programs, because if we didn't, those folks in those jobs would probably be at home in their parents' house, not doing anything.
Yeah.
Or maybe at like a day center, something like that, but not working. And they want to work. And then the third, and I would say most insidious level is sheltered workshops. These actually have a federal law that is a set aside. It's called 14C. And they have like a waiver where they do not have to pay people minimum wage. And so these individuals who work in a sheltered workshop make far below minimum wage. Some places say that they're trying to improve because it's not ideal working conditions. These individuals are most of the time, a lot of times, like in a warehouse it's just all of them together. It's very isolated, very excluded, and the individuals are exploited for the work that they're doing and not making that equal wage or have the access to opportunities. So
what was the reasoning for the lower wages?
They claim that the work that individuals are doing are really not skilled enough to warrant a minimum wage. For instance, just doing like really small, repetitive tasks to make widgets, and things like that. And so they say they can pay them less. Unfortunately, a lot of parents of adult children with disabilities really are afraid of those places closing down because they feel like their child is safe there. And it's
kind of like at least they have a place to go and a thing to do, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. And they enjoy being there with friends and things of that. Definitely understand that socializing is very important. But the sub-minimum wage just continues to reinforce this negative stereotype and stigma that you can pay people with disabilities, whatever, below the standard rate. You can treat them however you want. And it perpetuates that. And we're very much against the sheltered workshop rule.
Yeah. I could see that. So want to talk about that stigma piece a little bit more. This was another thing we talked about when you and I had connected. Kind of like the deaf people with the cochlear implants, right? Like some people choose to do it. Some people choose not to. It's their choice. Folks with disabilities, some people choose not to say that they have a disability. Some folks are very vocal and forward about it. What are your thoughts on that topic and people admitting they have disabilities and creating community around folks with disabilities? Like what are your thoughts on the language and the stigma that people use?
Historically, the language that has been used has been to kind of create this otherness around disability. Like these people are special. Like that's still in word used in law today, like special needs or extraordinary. But it was just different than the rest of society. And so that language has needed to evolve over time as well. And those words matter. Some individuals don't like using the word disability. They feel it is negative. It focuses on the limitations of things that we cannot do. I respect their opinions. The reason that we use the word disability is because that was the word that was chosen by the disability community when trying to advance their civil rights. And we center the voices of the disability community. That is the word that also comes with the civil rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in order to coalesce and identify ourselves as a unique part of our culture, it is the disability community. Some people, there was a wave of thinking back, I think it might have been in the 90s, that it was people with disabilities, people first. Was called people first language. Well, now there's been a shift, and those activists, those people who are more on the front lines of advancing disability rights, use identity first language, which is disabled people. So like I'm a disabled person. So it's interesting. We're seeing more and more groups that have been marginalized going with that, advancing that identity first language as well. So that has helped move us forward. For the people who don't identify as a person with a disability, not that they're against it, but that haven't really embraced it, I don't think they've had the benefit of sharing with peers in this space. I don't think they haven't had the benefit of understanding our history, the history of disability rights and inclusion and of our culture. And I think if more people knew that, they would say, oh my gosh, yeah, that's me. And so that's part of the work that we do at Starkloff Disability Institute is to help educate. We're just educating all the time because there is a rich history and there's so much to know because there's so many people impacted in so many different ways. So we educate all the time in the hopes to continue to advance opportunities. And when people get that experience of being among peers, that's when they really understand and begin to feel like, okay, I'm part of this group.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like the power of representation, right? In anything. If you see yourself more out in the real world, you start to acknowledge that there are more opportunities for you. It's okay to talk about the things that maybe you were scared to talk about that had that stigma. So yeah, I think that kind of representation does help. I mean, it helps everybody, right? It's helpful for all of us. Like we all want to see opportunity for ourselves.
Yeah. And I want to expand on that just a moment. And, it's hard for young people with disabilities to see themselves in positions of authority and people in successful careers of all types. The exposure that young people with disabilities get usually are to teachers and social workers and their parents. It's a much more limited experience. And so we see a lot of young people gravitating towards, I want to be a social worker. I want to be a nurse. And that's great. But our program for young people, it's called Dream Big. And what that program does is it introduces young people to the high growth, in demand careers of tomorrow. They work with companies they take tours, they do activities, they interview people, they learn about all these different jobs. And then that company has an opportunity to ask their employees who have a disability or maybe have a loved one with a disability to come forward and participate in that program as well. So that these young people can see themselves in positions in this company. And the leaders of the company also tell young people that they want to hire them, that they're welcome there. And those are not messages that they hear all the time. And so it's so important to get that into their heads at an early age that they can dream big. They can aim for really great careers and that they are not limited.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm involved with a nonprofit in Chicago called Embark that I've featured on the show before. And that's essentially what they do, or a big part of their mission with underserved communities in the Chicagoland area is you can't have a big vision for yourself if you haven't seen some bit of the world, right? And so these two teachers from the school on the south side of Chicago started taking their students on all these field trips to all these different cultural institutions and businesses and restaurants and theaters, like all these different places. And I mean, even like Whole Foods. And it was transformative for the students and still continues to be. So yeah, again, that just being able to see the world and see yourself in it in something different than where you are today is very powerful.
It is.
Yeah. Let's stay on stigma for a second because I even find there's like some voices in my head that creep up and like, I can catch them and sort of recognize, oh, that's not necessarily right. But I think there's just a lot of, I don't even know what the right word is. There's just a lot of biases and thoughts that we all have. And so one of the things that I think about is the balance between accommodation and accountability. And I'm a believer that we should treat everybody as equal as we can, give equal opportunity, and build our workplaces especially to be human-centered and human-friendly. And then there's also a boundary there, though, where the human being on the other end needs to be accountable to doing their work and to developing themselves and to handling themselves with a certain professionalism and just all the things that make an individual successful. Mm-hmm. And so I think I really believe that success is in the middle ground where you have folks in power who are empowering their people, and then you have people who are taking personal accountability. Where do you see that line in the disability community, and like what guidance would you give to employers to try to get that balance right when maybe they're overcorrecting on one or the other?
Mm-hmm. So from the employer's perspective, and we're talking about stigma, and I use the word misperceptions a lot, and because I don't think that people want to, discriminate, or they don't want to have bias and stigma. They know that, but they still do because they have not had experiences yet working with the people that they don't know about. And once you get to know a person, those misperceptions are just dissolved. So I would say there's a few things that stand out when an employer is considering hiring a person with a disability. The number one concern that we hear is performance.
Sure.
Like, can this person do the same work as other people? And they also think an accommodation is going to be too expensive. And then they also think that, once I hire this person and if they don't perform, I can't fire them.
Yeah.
So we know that those are thoughts going through employers' heads. And so we work side by side with a lot of employers to help them feel comfortable and hold their hand through this process. But at the same time, we empower the individuals with disabilities themselves to be proactive and take action. A couple examples of those different things is, well, first of all, my mind is running amok right now. I'm thinking about all these different people that we have worked with that are in these jobs that are just rock stars. They're just knocking it out of the park. And they probably do have a small accommodation. The average accommodation costs less than $500, and many are free. We are seeing, like, so many times people have asked over the years for remote work opportunities, and it was never heard of. It was denied time and time again because, like, well, how are we going to monitor your performance? And how do we know what you're doing? You got to be in the group. Until the pandemic hit, and now everybody works remote, at least part of the time.
Maybe that wasn't real. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So even like that doesn't cost anything to let somebody work from home, not really. And, there are just very slight modifications. I will tell you, I use some software that is like a voiceover software. It also magnifies things. I think that program is less than $500, and and it's also paid for. Many like state governments will help pay for accommodations. They want people with disabilities to be in the workforce. They will help provide those accommodations from a financial perspective. There's also tax incentives for hiring people with disabilities. But when it comes down to it, employers need to think about their culture. And is it a culture of inclusion? Or is it a dog-eat-dog organization? Will you make your systems, your policies, your physical plans, your everything just more accessible and inclusive? That way everybody can improve their performance. As simple as like putting an automatic door opener on an exterior door, right? I am kind of working in this space right now where that was not originally part of their physical plant. We asked that they do it. They gladly did it, and they couldn't believe that they didn't. It was such an oversight in the building process. Yeah. So they put this automatic door opener on because we have a couple employees who are wheelchair users and needed it. Now everybody that goes in that building is hitting the automatic door because they have their hands full or whatever. It benefits everyone. It like a quiet room, or like a sensory room for people to kind of go and chill out. Well, now that was kind of originally came out of the neurodiversity group. And now everyone enjoys rooms where they can just like the mindfulness or wellness room, right?
Yeah.
So those are examples of things that improve everyone's experience and performance on the job that originated probably as an accommodation. So if you look at it as a way to improve your culture, your employees will recognize that and embrace it. Definitely. And as far as performance goes, if a person with a disability with their accommodation is not performing, then you can fire them. Sometimes it's not a good fit. And you have to also recognize that because fully integrated employment among the disability community is very new in the broad, history of our country, that I think some patience helps and some really good communication and some understanding of the environment and the job at hand. I know that person who is deaf was one time hired by a local company, and he was actually working in HR. His desk was situated in a part of the office where there was lots and lots of traffic, foot traffic, and he was being distracted because he thought people might be coming up to him to talk. And so he just needed to move his desk. For a long time, several months. There was growing frustration from the employer because this person wasn't finishing all of his work on time. And he was on the verge of being fired when we came in, and we're like, oh my gosh, he told us what the situation was. We told them, and they're like, oh my gosh, is that it? That was all we need to do was move his desk. But it was because of that fear.
Yeah.
And because of the differences in communication that almost, he almost was fired because of that. And there's no reason to do that.
I'm smiling because it just, again and again and again and again, it comes down to, wait, you mean they weren't communicating well? Like so many problems. Almost every problem between people comes down to people not communicating well.
Right.
It's just mind-boggling how often that's the solution. One other one I want to talk about, and it's kind of about performance, but I could see this being very real. And I know I've talked to business leaders about this kind of issue, which is there are plenty of able people, like fully capable, fully able, who take a victim mentality and will try to abuse whatever system they're a part of. And I could see leaders saying that not that this person is going to underperform, but it opens up a risk where now if that person starts to play the victim because we had to fire them for cause, that now we're just going to get dragged in. Like it exposes us to getting dragged into a lawsuit. I'm not saying this happens. I'm not saying this is a real thing most of the time, but like, I think we've seen enough people in general create issues like this that it's just like, well, now there's a real thing here that's an accommodation, and there's an increased risk if they were to play that card that like we get in big trouble or something like that. I could see that sort of like thought pattern creeping into somebody's head. Do you have any thoughts for leaders on like how to coach folks or document performance along the way? I don't know. Any thoughts on that sort of bias?
Well, I think that there is, like anything else, I mean, there's a spectrum of people and their approaches, to, I'm going to sue this employer because they didn't do this accommodation or I was fired, whatever. That can happen among any community. It could happen from the non-disabled or the disabled, anyway. I think that is going to happen no matter, because it is just a spectrum of folks. But I have seen people who have talked with people who've been very wronged on a job, and they are very hesitant to take any legal action. And I think, and that is really true for the majority of people, they overlook discrimination so frequently. They may not.
Yeah, it's far more likely it's going to go the other way.
Absolutely.
Than that way.
And the only times we really do see legal action or a person with a disability taking a legal action, it has to be really egregious, like really egregious. We don't necessarily encourage people to take any legal action unless it is something, and we're not, we refer people to an organization that does that if they really want to pursue it. But I don't feel that we get very far in terms of our relationships with employers by having an adversarial relationship, right?
Yeah.
So we want to be everybody's friend here. Everybody just increase that communication, make sure we're being very clear on both sides in order to just to make the company more successful and the employee more successful. There's an old saying is that you can't shake hands with a clenched fist. And I think about that frequently. But there are definitely some times where action is warranted. And there's a place for legal action, because it has helped advance the cause of access and opportunity for disabled people. We have a long history of activism and that I wish more people would know about because it's really great and rich history. But people have been oppressed for a long time, very much discriminated against. And I find more often than not, even when they do have a legal case, they would not pursue it.
Well, that's a good point. There's probably been way more discrimination than there has been victimhood out there. Like, I don't know what the magnitude would be, but I would imagine it's many magnitudes larger that there's discrimination out there against the disability community than disability community folks suing their employer.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And, in terms of performance and praise, document everything. We really just want to be treated the same way everybody else is treated. We're not looking for to cut corners or to have some special exemption. We want to do exactly what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you see story after story of that, right? Of parents who sort of created an environment for their kids where they felt very normal, and that kid with whatever disability it was, grew up thinking that they were able to do anything they wanted to do and, felt very empowered. And so, I think that can translate to the workforce. I would imagine it would have to, right? If you create an environment where you view your people as being able to do great things, oftentimes they'll do great things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Set them up for success.
Yeah. There was a study around that where they took teachers with young students and they tested all the students at the beginning of the year. And then they gave the teachers the report on who was gifted and who was not. And they sort of rigged it. And then they tested the students again at the end of the year to see how much progress they had made. And what they found was that if they had told a teacher that a student was gifted, the student would view them as gifted, and through their interactions over the course of that year, that student would actually progress farther than the non-gifted students. But whether it's time, attention, opportunity, just like whatever that is, it actually created it. And what they did was they took half the group and they actually gave the real results. And then they took half the group and they gave randomized results. And it didn't matter which group you were in. The students who were in the gifted group performed better at the end of the year. And so, that translates here, which is just if you look at your people and you see greatness and you see potential, you will actually create greatness in that workforce. But if you look at your team and you see limitations, you're going to create a limited workforce. Like you as the leader can actually create that just by the way you look at your team.
That is exactly right. I feel that to be true in so many cases, myself personally and among our people. Historically, we have faced just low expectations about what we can do, how we can contribute to society. And it becomes internalized. There's actually a term that we use called internalized oppression. And it really is when you embody those negative beliefs that are being imposed upon you by society. And that's why you see disabled people not able to break free of that. And it's really no fault of their own. It is society's, viewpoint and mindset that keeps people just oppressing themselves at some points in time.
Yeah. So I just talked a little bit about, inspiration and viewing people as capable, but you threw out the term inspiration porn when we were prepping for this and how dangerous that can be. So while I talk about inspiration on one side, let's also talk about the other side. What is inspiration porn and why is it bad?
Oh my gosh. Your listeners need to watch a TED Talk by Stella Young. She's a disability rights activist. She was the person who coined that term. Here are a couple examples of inspiration porn. You see it all over the place. Maybe on your local news, you'll see a story about a local high school kid with Down syndrome asked another kid at school with Down syndrome to the prom, and they were nominated as homecoming king and queen, that type of thing. A poster with, someone with a prosthetic leg, like running track. And then it says, what's your excuse, on it. Or this is my favorite is a disability is a bad attitude, or there's no more greater disability than a bad attitude. So all of that was created by non-disabled people. I will tell you that right now. It is harmful in so many ways. First of all, it tokenizes our experience. It's not a real reflection of who we are. And it also creates like this exceptionalism for things that are often mundane. Every high school kid, goes to the prom, asks someone to the prom. Right? You never see a prom king and queen who are non-disabled, on the news.
Yeah.
And so it's that low expectations so that when someone with a disability really kind of does the same thing as everyone else, they're pointed out, and again, kind of it creates this otherness that that's not how we feel. We want to be just part of the community. And that inspiration porn really, it's used by non-disabled people to make themselves feel better. I even experienced it myself. I told you I was legally blind, and I love to ride my bike. I've never been able to drive a car. And I took my bike out for the first time this year, and I just moved back to kind of like the urban area of St. Louis, and I rode my bike by our Gateway Arch and some other things downtown. Like, it was great because I feel free when I'm able to move independently in the community. And I took a couple of pictures and I put them up on Facebook, and I said, I am so excited to be back in the city. I got my bike out. Well, I also had 100 comments from people saying how inspirational I was that I rode my bike. Well, I can ride my bike. Everybody rides it, so it gives me a little cringy feeling that, why should I be applauded for, just doing the same thing as everybody else? It's something I enjoy and I can do safely. Although there's some people do worry, but I keep myself safe and I know my own limitations. So it is for those of us who are more in the forefront of disability rights. When we see inspiration porn, we just cringe. It's just cringeworthy.
Can I push back on that just a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I like, we talked about representation being important and people being able to see themselves out there doing things. So I get the tokenization piece. I get that you want, you go ride your bike. You don't need everybody's I don't know, like kudos that you can go do this normal thing. I totally understand that.
Yeah.
By the same token, I would have to think that there's value in somebody who has a disability seeing somebody else with a disability succeed and do things that they didn't think possible for themselves. I look at able-bodied people who go climb mountains or do something else or push themselves, and I'm inspired by that to push myself further. And so I would imagine there's got to be some benefit to somebody who is legally blind coming across your article and saying, "Oh, I didn't realize that was something I could do, and maybe I can go do it." Can you talk to that a little bit? Because I see some of that being valuable.
I respect your thoughts on that for sure. I think though there's a couple of different things, and that is it really diminishes the barriers to access that people face at real barriers that people face every day. And it really kind of whitewashes those. And
I get that with the amputated leg, the person with the prosthetic and what's your excuse? All right, F off. There are a lot of excuses. So I get that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
It's the representation. It's the news article or the Facebook post or things like that I could see being pretty valuable for people to say oh, wow, that's great. I could go do that. Or my child could go do that.
And here's the thing. I feel like that's the only time that we're featured anywhere. And so there's no representation, for instance, in Hollywood or, in the arts and film and things like that. You don't see people with disabilities just being leading in everyday life. And those are the images that we want to see. We want to see oh, here's a sitcom. And then the next door neighbor, has a kid with autism, or, their coworker is someone who is a wheelchair. And that's not the main storyline about that person. It just so happens that they have a disability. But just being portrayed in regular life is so much more valuable and it's not harmful. That's what we're looking for, really.
Got it.
Understand your opinion on that. It's all coming from a good place. We get it. And really, when people applaud me for doing different things, I'm like, that's that I know that it's coming from a good place, but we need actual representation in boardrooms, in classrooms, in companies, just people living the same lives as everybody else wants to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would love to see the actress from A Quiet Place do more because she was phenomenal.
Yes.
And I thought that movie was incredibly well done, integrating her disability into it. I mean, it was integrated into the storyline pretty specifically, but it was not out. You can tell me it was, but it seemed not tokenized to me. It seemed like it was just like a very natural part of that story. And she also, happened to be deaf.
Yes. Yes. And the deaf community has done a really great job of being featured more in film. There's actually, and I know at least one organization that works really hard to get authentic representation in the film industry, both in front of the camera and behind the camera, because it's the people that are making the decisions are, behind the camera about who to cast and what that character does.
Yeah.
But just that non-disabled people playing the part of people with disabilities is also something that we do not support. I know, and people say, well, it's acting. Well, it is. There are probably a lot of really good actors out there with disabilities who are just fighting for their chance to get in there.
Yeah.
And so we want to, it comes back to always kind of like really centering the voices of the community and understanding that their lived experience as a disabled person has real value that can improve everybody's lives. So that it kind of always comes back to that, listening to the people.
Yeah. Well, in this and everything else, it always comes back to listening to the people. Yeah, for sure. I'm actually, through this podcast, we're creating a real world event where we are going to teach heads of HR some design skills. And one of the core design skills is discovery. It's going out to the people, understanding what they really want, what they need, how they behave, what their struggles are, and then building whatever your solution is, whether it's a product, a service, the way you work, building it in a way that's more human-centered and human-friendly for what their lived experience actually is. So yeah, I'm a believer in that. This has been a fantastic conversation. Definitely opened my eyes in a lot of ways. One last question is I got two last questions. The first one is, if you were an employer, where would you start with this? Like, what recommendations do you have for an employer who wants to start getting better at this?
Let's see. We'll go to starkloff.org.
My next question was, where can people engage with you? So this is all tied into one.
But no, there's educate yourselves and really focus on culture. That's what will really change the systems. And that's what we're really focused on doing. It's not, one accommodation at a time. It is really understanding the culture of your organization. And there are so many different ways that people with disabilities are going to be excluded or probably excluded right now from your organization, whether it's like in imagery. Don't use stock photos either, by the way, please. Use actual images of people with disabilities. And we can tell the difference. So,
Oh, interesting.
And think about your communications, your physical plan, your website. Can people with disabilities do they have access to the career page on your website, or is it inaccessible and they can't even fill out an application? So there's lots of different aspects to this. There's a couple of national organizations as well. I want to point out to the Disability In is mostly comprised of large corporations as members, but they had created something called the Disability Equality Index, the DEI. And it's a great survey that employers can take. And it's like a questionnaire, and it goes through all these different aspects of your business. And then you can see how well you're doing. And then there's like some national competition on that. But that's a good place to start. There's also, there's also starkloff.org. So we've got, and I do say that because we really take a holistic approach to working with companies, because we do know that they're the ones that are doing the hiring, right? I mean, so it's their culture, their physical and digital facilities, as well as all the policies and the way their employees are trained. That training and development piece is so important. So making sure that they are paying attention to all of those different things. I think that is a lot, more than one place to start, but
well, hopefully people can pull something out of that.
Yeah,
I'm sure they'll be able to. Yeah. Well, Lori, thank you for the work you do. Thank you for coming on here and sharing it with us, and wish you all the best, and wish that for everyone who is listening to this, that they go back and a little more of an open mind, little more focus on making work more accessible and more fun for all of us in every community. So thank you.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity.
Hey folks, one last thing before you go. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to hit subscribe so you can stay up to date with future guests. That's it. Thanks for coming. Go make the most of your business and the people in it.